Hello and welcome back. My name is Derek Main, and this is my channel where I talk about books. So, today I'm going to talk about Stoner by John Williams. And Stoner is a book that and I think a lot of readers have known about for a very long time. I think to call it a cult classic or underrated masterpiece, which if you Google Stoner by John Williams, I think both of those phrases are, you're going to run into them. But I think to call it that at this stage is reaching a little bit. Obviously, you can tell from the cover, this is an NYRB Classics. And Stoner is one of those NYRB Classics, at least from my view as a reader, that really cements their catalog. And by that, I just mean, earlier, last year, I read Hard Rain Falling by Don Carpenter for the first time. And that's another one of theirs. It's sort of it's a big text in their, catalog. Stoner, I'd love to know the numbers and tell me in the comments what you think, if you think I'm crazy. But I'm going to guess it is their most sold book. And if someone knows, even better. But at least in the crowd that I've known or whatever for a long time, whatever, it's an extremely popular work. And I think one of the things that you hear about it, one of the things I heard about it was it's going to be the writing that's going to draw you in. And so kind of ignore how the story seems at first glance to be a little simplistic. Well, I have no issues with that. I had never picked it up, frankly, not necessarily because of the subject, but there are a lot of books. And no one who talked to me about this book really ever gave me the impression that it was something sort of that I would be interested in, if that makes sense. I mean, I knew that it was well loved, but a lot of the people that were really ferocious, sort of like, fans of this book, I'm thinking probably 10 years ago or so, maybe 15 now. But anyway, it doesn't matter. A while back, all you kind of heard was that it had this really, really like illustrious prose, and that, the writing was just fantastic. Yeah, the writing itself, the words, the sound. And again, that's just coming from what my experience was as a reader and from what I had heard and gathered. Well, I actually don't, believe it or not, read a lot of work that is lush in that way that I had it in my head that Stoner was. So I was never really rushing out for it or anything. Well, I got it last year at NYRB's annual sale. I always get a few, and this was one of them. And this week I picked it up. Now, my buddy Sam loves this book, read it very recently. I think he said he read it in 3 sittings. And you see something interesting here, right? And this is going to tell something of the story about my read of Stoner, which you got these 3 flags. So what I do is I have no code or anything. That's just like whatever color is there. I flag out just like a section I like. That's it. I mean, and then oftentimes, it's really nice to go to your bookshelf when you are in the mood to read, for a moment or something like that, but you don't necessarily want to get into poetry at that time. You just want to read some prose. It's really nice to pick up a book and then you go to your flag and just read that sentence or paragraph, and suddenly this flood of memories return. And these memories are where you read it, how you were feeling when you read it. How old were your kids? Had you met your wife? What about a reread? Had you reread it? I don't reread a lot because I'm so scared of death, and therefore feel that I can defeat it by always striving towards reading everything ever printed. No, I'm just kidding. But, and then you get to remember what it is specifically about that line or that phrase that hits you, and you can think of all the works that you've read since then, all the media you've consumed, all the life experiences you've had, maybe your own artistic work, and see, did this line, this phrase, this thing that stopped me, did it grab me in such a way that it entered into my own consciousness, or have I seen it said better? Have I seen it around my life? And so in the beginning of this, for the first third or whatever, you see I've got a few things and then it completely falls off. Now, there are two reasons that happens in my life. One is I move room to room. I joke with a friend of mine that I am always horizontal. I'm always lying down, like in a bath, in a chair, or like on the bed. So sometimes I may not have my flags with me. But usually, something like the next day, I'll pick something up. I was reading Reiki last night, and I didn't have my little flags with me because I'm not like, I'm dorky, right? But like not, sometimes it's just not right there. But I remembered that this morning. I was like, oh yeah, I need to find that thing because there was something that I wanted to. So I usually do remember. So maybe there'd be one more or something. But for the most part, I usually hit the things I want to hit. And Stoner, how long have I gone? 5 minutes? That's all right. That's okay. I'm going to have a weird review of Stoner because Stoner is a great book. And I think there's no denying that it is extremely competently well written. And I also think there's probably no denying that there are certain readers who are particularly fond of this style. We'll get to that question of writing style in a minute because I have a book to compare it to in that way. And then with that book to compare it to, I have a brag, which is awesome. So that's coming up. But first, Stoner it's the story of one man's life. And in that man is born to a very poor farm in Missouri. And he's born, right before the 1900s. So maybe he's like 1850 or whatever, turn of the century, kind of is when he is a kid. And he, right at like 18 or whatever, his father suggests he go to the School of Agriculture to learn, which has just opened up in Columbia, so it's the University of Missouri, to learn how to better, get more out of the ground. And so he goes by, he walks basically the 40 miles either by buggy or walking to the University of Missouri. And from that moment, circumstances and events and everything are going to kind of happen to him in very small, subtle ways, the type of experiences that happen to all of us. And he is going to be there in Columbia for the rest of his life. And it is going to simply follow that life from being a young graduate student. We're going to get here in a minute to the point where his life drastically changes. But once it does change that one time, it actually never does again, which is odd for a story. He has this event happen, which again, we'll get to in a second, which changes the course of his study. And by changing the course of his study, he changes the rest of his life. And that's happened to many people, of course. But from that point, the things in his life follow a very traditional pattern. He gets married. He has departmental squabbles with another professor who ends up becoming the head of department. So work politics. He writes a book very, very early on in his career, but he writes a scholarly book as an English professor. That's a moment. Has an affair in his 40s, right? He has a daughter. He has a kid. And his parents die, and his wife's parents die. These sort of things of life. But there's actually, even with the affair is so, his regular wife, and we'll get to this here in a moment because it's definitely part of the reading of the book. It is, the women in this book are portrayed very poorly, and his wife is just a very withdrawn, unlikable person. And her motives are never quite clear. She was born into like a little bit more money in a St. Louis family. But she certainly said yes to marrying him the day after they met or something. So she did make a choice there. And anyway, my point being there that stuff is not filled in. Okay. So because of the relationship, which is a very difficult one with his wife, even the affair is not really that crazy. I mean, it provides an opportunity for elements of the plot to move forward, but in his own life, I mean, it's sort of just a happening. It comes easily, it goes easily, there's swells of feeling while it's there, and then when it's not there, it's forgotten. The swells of feeling are told to us almost as diagnosing William Stoner, the man we're following. It really plays out like a very psychological profile, the whole thing, because rarely does the character, any of the characters, perform actions that then we, the reader, are going to extrapolate meaning from. Instead, what typically ends up happening is an event occurs and we just sort of get the psychological profile in the moment of how William Stoner and then any other tertiary characters involved in that situation or incident feel about it internally, and sort of has that drama quality and moves on. Well, so now we'll get to the comparison thing. It reminded me of a recent read, An Adultery by Alexander Thoreau. And the reason it reminded me of An Adultery was Adultery is it's a good book. It's not a great book. And I'm reading it as part of my sort of curiosity about Stephen Moore. The critics knew, and Stephen Moore is, over here. He's the one who wrote My Back Pages. I'm sure I've mentioned him before. He's a big influence on me and a lot of readers. He is perhaps the leading literary critic of the day. And anyway, so he recently came out with a book on Thoreau, so I was really interested in Thoreau. I don't think I did. God, if I did, that'd be embarrassing and I didn't know it. But I don't think I did a video on this book because it's a little difficult to talk about in any sort of thing other than, this guy has an affair, and it goes very deeply into the psychology of that man and the woman. Well, so you're drawn into it the whole time, and you're reading just this rich, lush piece. And then afterwards, it's, kind of in one, out one. And I think Stoner is the same way. I think The Affair in particular reminded me of that, but I also think the writing is lush, it's enjoyable, it's a very quick read, and there are these nice sentences. I don't want to call them beautiful because that's, frankly, it's a little bit of a stretch, only because it's such a distant work. I mean, the narration is has a distance between William Stoner and then William Stoner, this born a poor farmer into an English professor, but sort of used to the toil of all of work and of all of pain being kind of all of life being this like quiet, painful thing. That's how he is, how he seems. And that's how he attacks the world. So it's just a very distant, cold book in some ways. So some readers, I think, are going to be pulled out of it for that reason. Some readers are going to be pulled out of it because they may mistake the poorly written female characters for misogyny. And when I say mistake, please, that's not a belittling term. I understand that John Williams, the writer, may have some issues. I don't know. I mean, he's dead. I'm certain of that. But I just have, literally, just like on Twitter, I've seen some people say, like, he was a jerk. Okay, probably. And there's you'll never go broke betting on writers or artists or people to be jerks. But it's a failing of the work, I think, that we do not get more out of his wife, Edith, in terms of why she is so hateful, spiteful, manipulative, and just contemptuous of William Stoner, of their daughter, frankly, of everyone and everything, including herself. A very self-hatred there, too. Just deeply unlikable character. And as a plot piece, so here's the other voice in my head sitting here saying, but Derek, it's a profile of one man. So that was his wife, and that is what that is. Okay, sure. But we have to sometimes think about the mechanics of the story. We think about the mechanics of the story in something like this, particularly because it is an English professor. It is someone who fell in love with literature. So let's think about the mechanics of the story. Why was William Stoner given, why did he need, for plot purposes or whatnot, that particular style of wife? Okay, here's the things that it does. It shows us William Stoner as a man capable of an incredible reserve of stoicism and an ability to maintain steadiness despite there being emotional turmoil and in some cases emotional warfare being waged at him, but never with him, because that stoicism allows him to almost look at his life from this 30,000-foot view where he's not actually participating in it. He's sort of analyzing it out, how it happens. Okay, so is that something that could only or is necessarily tied to being given to us through the wife? I would argue no. I think in every aspect of William Stoner, when it comes to how he interacts with everyone, you would have gotten everything you needed from that. Okay, well, what else does the wife do? Well, the wife allows William Stoner to be, pitiful's not the right word. It's not redemptive. It allows him to be likable, maybe, perhaps, rooting for him, maybe. Maybe that's a better way to put it. It gives you an end to root for him, because though he's not an evil man or a bad man in any way, in fact, he's a quite principled, honorable man, he is so devoid of the kinds of I'm going to stop and go back. He is such a cold, distant man. And I know I've used that before, so now it feels like I went on this whole ramble to get nowhere. But he is not particularly likable on the page. In real life, I think you can imagine this person and it would be a fine, a colleague that is perfectly fine, but not someone that you would be close with. And so in that way, perhaps there is some of the author wanting to give him his primary secondary character, so Stoner's primary secondary character, such negation in her awful qualities that Stoner would look above it, and he definitely does. He gets all of the benefits of the doubt when it comes to their daughter, and how he is a wonderful, if quiet, father who the little girl adores, to then the girl being ripped away from him, by the mother, his wife, who they still live together. They don't sleep in the same bed or anything almost immediately, but they still live together. He gets every opportunity by always taking the high road, whether it's just the two of them or the two of them plus the daughter or at a huge party. He always gets that opportunity to be that sort of noble, like, I married her and I'll stay with her, and and that's a very unlikable quality to me. So we're getting, back to that unlikability, back to that weird mix. What's the nature of that character? I don't know. I am going to go with, I do not know whether John Williams, nor do I care. I only care about what's on the page. So I don't know what was in his heart, and it doesn't matter. I think he could not write women very well. And I think that's why you get that. And I'll just add to that by saying the only other women that are in this book The first one is his mother, who basically speaks not at all, and as soon as her husband, his father, dies, she just wants to stay in the home and wait to die. She's defined in no way as an individual, and only as almost a piece of property of her husband's. And then the next woman that comes in, we've discussed the wife, but the next woman would be her aunt, the wife's aunt, whom he first is introduced to the wife with, and then the wife's mother. Both women that are equally unlikable in terms of they seem to only care about status. They are just sort of trying to climb the scene, and nothing really seems to be real in their characteristics. It's more just kind of like, all right, this is how we can relate, this type of person as opposed to the way a person really is. And then he's got the affair in the middle portion. This woman is the best written of those, I suppose, although she is only written in terms of the intelligence, which she's very surprised about, of course, but the intelligence that she is showing in her doctoral thesis and the work in the book that she is working towards publishing. And he gets a real joy out of teaching. He's a great teacher. He gets a real joy out of assisting her with that work. And they are passionate. They do make love, and there is talk of that. But there's no showing you any believability with it. I hate that word, but there's no showing you any moments of their relationship where we can just see that something special or interesting is happening. Instead, it's just told to us. It's just said. Okay, my last negative part about the book, I'll just say, is that thing overall there, and I hate the show don't tell and all that stuff, but just too much is exposition. Too much is, the psychological profile, as I said, similar to Thoreau's, for it to be a complete masterpiece, in my opinion. This is a good book. Again, it's fun to read. You can kind of get through it quick. And I think I was about 50 pages in when I thought I was onto something real special. And I made some comments about it too to some folks. And I was like, I can't believe I waited this long, And that last 200 pages or so, it didn't work for me. And what do? You just say that. I mean, it was a good book. I liked it. I finished it again very quickly. I just don't feel that there's anything within Stoner that is going to particularly stay with me. Besides the three things I'll end with, so I can keep this under 30 minutes. And I'm sorry, this is the new style, okay? So I know it's not as professional. I know it's longer. I know it's rambly. And I try to think of audience as I'm making this, but it's difficult because I don't know what people want or whatever. Maybe they just stumbled upon this because they like Stoner, in which case they just got some weird dude rambling, or maybe you guys like my weird rambling and there's a few of you that say for that's awesome, but I'm just gonna have to be me and press submit. I think that's the only way to do it. Okay. Whew. This is the best part of the book, and this is the part that really, really drew me in. He's in his second semester probably. He's had all farm classes, and now he's got to take some of his non-science courses. And this is perhaps second year, sorry. So during the first semester of the second year. But the required survey of English literature troubled and disquieted him in a way nothing had ever done before. And I just want to make note of that on page 10 because for me, I mean, when I caught this bug, when I was in the pages of a work and felt no other piece of art, no other communication, nothing else in the world could express the same way, could talk so singularly in the moment only to you, since you are the one reading the words in your head with your interior monologue, right? Your interior voice yet it is written by someone else. And so for just a brief moment, our loneliness at being only oneself inside a body is almost lifted, and someone joins you in your consciousness to share consciousness. And that is why I read. That's the thing with it for me that pulls me in every time. And so I loved that phrase. The required survey of English literature troubled and disquieted him in a way nothing had ever done before, because that trouble and that disquiet is what I want from that's it. It's not, I want to be shaken. All right. And we're going to get now to the last two things are on the same page as 12 and 13. He is in this course, and the professor, who ends up becoming somewhat of a cold and distant mentor. Of course, this is Stoner, so everything's cold and distant. But the professor who at least hires him, where he then, Stoner goes on to have tenure and live out the rest of his life as a professor, perhaps only but once, to one weekend in the Ozarks with the woman he's cheating on, even leave. He walks from that farm to that university, and that walk was as far as he ever needed to go. And a big aspect of this story early on is defining what the university is and what academia can be. And academia today fails in so many ways that we're well familiar of, but it certainly falls short of the absolute reverence that William Stoner, and that most likely the author himself, but certainly the work Stoner has on an educational institution, a university, because it believes, and in fact, in a very important character who I'm not going to spoil what happens to him or who he is because it's too important for it, but a very important character early on diagnoses the university as a kind of asylum for people who could not quite make it in the world because they were too principled, right? Such as Stoner was one reason, or they were too mad, such as the person who was giving the speech, or they were ambitious but just not quite sharp enough to make a lot of money or something. I think that was his reason for the other, but I didn't like that third reason very well because I didn't think it made sense. Although perhaps I didn't make sense of it, and that it was a reading issue and not a writing issue. But there was this idea that the university could house you and save you, and you could live within these walls and the ivory tower of scholarship without having to be of the world. And so, obviously, you saw when this book started, World War I, and then we're going to go to World War II. It's obviously the Depression. I mean, it is a very, very difficult time to be alive. And turn of the century, right? And I mean, look, we're just doing one right now, and it's like, it's almost like the century just like needs like 20 years or so, or 44, God, let's hope not, to just kind of like get rolling, you know what I mean? And like find its place. I don't know, whatever. But through that, at the university, he was completely spared from all of that. It only mattered in how it affected the day-to-day operations of the university. All right, so that thing for him and that initial pull is happening here in this English class. He's got this teacher who is the one who hires him and ultimately lets him stay there on for the whole time. And this is the first teacher that kind of like shakes his head up, and this is how he does it. He is reading Shakespeare to the class, and then Sloane turned his dark, bright eyes upon Stoner. "Mr. Stoner, what does the sonnet mean?" Stoner swallowed and tried to open his mouth. "It is a sonnet, Mr. Stoner," Sloane said dryly. "A poetical composition of 14 lines, with a certain pattern I'm sure you have memorized. It is written in the English language, which I believe you have been speaking for some years. Its author is William Shakespeare, a poet who is dead, but who nevertheless occupies a position of some importance in the minds of a few." He looked at Stoner for a moment more, and then his eyes went blank as they fixed unseeingly beyond the class. Without looking at his book, he spoke the poem again, and his voice deepened and softened as if the words and sounds and rhythms had for a moment become himself. "That time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none or few do hang, upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day, as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire, that on the ashes of his youth doth lay, as the death-bed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long." In a moment of silence, someone cleared his throat. Sloane repeated the last lines, his voice booming flat, becoming his own again. "This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long." Sloane's eyes came back to William Stoner, and he said dryly, "Mr. Shakespeare speaks to you across 300 years, Mr. Stoner. Do you hear him? Be good to folks."